Here's how it was supposed to work. Around 1960, a small group of very rich individuals met in Wichita, Kansas, with the sole intent of preserving something very near and dear to their own hearts: their aggregate wealth. They called themselves the Governors. They worked tirelessly at the grassroots level to persuade common folks that the best way for them to get rich was to stop big government from making all them pesky rules and regulations that interfere with profits. The Governors started by stocking school boards with conservatives who gradually modified the curriculum to reflect their own views. Sports rule, music sucks, winning is everything, greed is good, greed based on science and math is even better, liberal arts are for losers, and suit their own purposes. A society of free thinkers isn't necessarily good for productivity. They worked up to installing like-minded jurists in local and regional courts. Then somebody found out climate change could adversely impact the whole dynamic. In California, they had already passed a bunch of regulations dealing with pollution because some whiny little bitches in Los Angeles complained that they couldn't breathe. Really? Then more states started passing laws about polluting the environment and other tree hugger nonsense that would almost certainly impact the bottom line. Now, climate change was the final straw. But they had to hedge their bets just in case it turned out that climate change was real. On the one hand, they created ad campaigns and tweets that claimed climate change is a hoax, and besides, even if there is a shred of truth to the silly premise, the fossil fuel industry already has this thing under control. On the other hand, they formed their own clandestine community, their own clandestine committee to study the best way to survive climate change. Not for everyone to survive climate change, only rich folks. In the mid-60s, the Governors had heard about the Wilderness Act. They studied their options and decided a wilderness area might just suit their nefarious needs. They got together a group of lobbyists and drew up an amendment to the Wilderness Act. They called it the Stewardship Clause. It said rich people care about wilderness too. In recognition of wealthy people's selfless commitment to the ecology, the Wilderness Act would be amended to allow sponsorship of small plots of land in a wilderness area. Let's say a quarter acre each. To prove the purity of their intentions, each qualified sponsor, benefactor, would pledge an annual $10,000 tax-deductible contribution to government coffers. This is what government officials call found money. The feds had 1.5 million acres in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex alone, which qualified for sponsorship. That's 6 million sponsorable plots of hard-packed dirt in an otherwise hostile wilderness area. Plots which, by the way, weren't paying a dime toward their own upkeep. At $10,000 a year per plot, that represents a nice chunk of revenue. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. A qualified benefactor was defined as an individual or corporation with more than $20 million in assets. The deal was the benefactor wouldn't own the land. The benefactor promised to preserve the land in its pristine state. The benefactor's responsibility would go from the surface and all its verdant vegetation all the way down to a hypothetical boundary line 20 feet underground. In order to sponsor a plot of land, the benefactor would be obliged to join the Bob Marshall Wilderness Stewardship Society, BMWSS. The initiation fee to join the BMWSS was a cool $1,000,000, plus an annual membership fee of $10,000. First year's membership was included in the initiation fee, which would qualify the benefactor to enjoy all rights and privileges thereto. Although such rights and privileges weren't written down, it was tacitly agreed that they would include access to sanctuary in case sanctuary became necessary. Charter members went to the head of the line. The BMWSS managed the delicate relationship between the benefactors and the federal government. One of the BMWSS responsibilities to their members was to build a prototype for sanctuary, which would serve as a model in case the need for an actual sanctuary became imminent. Of course, the BMWSS wouldn't build the prototype, they'd hire it done. The first 3,000 sponsorships referenced quarter-acre plots clustered around the anomaly discovered 12 years earlier by the STC process. By this time, Fat Albert had tunneled into the underground cave, and work was proceeding on establishing a foundation for structures planned but not yet built. There was, however, a problem with light in the underground cave. There was none. It was downright gloomy underground. As soon as the BMW SS had signed up benefactors for the first 3,000 sponsorships, they discovered an exotic strain of fungus growing on a small stand of trees in the middle of the sponsored 750 contiguous acres. The BMW SS set a controlled burn to eradicate the fungus. It was wildly successful. The feds congratulated themselves on having prevented a wholesale infestation of the entire wilderness area without spending a penny of the United States Forestry Service budget. The BMW SS benefactors were truly stewards of the land. Now that the area was cleared of infested foliage, the BMW SS set about to clean up the mess. Part of the cleanup effort included drilling test holes and taking samples to make sure the fungus hadn't crept underground. As they finished drilling each test hole, they filled it with a patented variety of reflective solar tubing that piped natural sunlight all the way down to the cave. They surreptitiously hired 150 high-rise building workers from New York City sworn to secrecy and housed them off-site in Missoula and Kalispell. Both towns appreciated the boost to their economies. The fungus eradication effort took 5 long years. To the outside world, it looked like the ultimate act of ecological philanthropy. It seemed these wealthy folks from the other side of the country really cared about preserving the Montana wilderness. Several articles and op-eds were written in local newspapers touting their selfless commitment to the cause. When they were sure the fungus was well and truly stamped out, they covered over the scar they'd made in the bob and replanted the surface area with ponderosa pine seedlings, leaving plenty of space for sunlight to seep through the solar tubes. The area looked even better than it did before. Talk about your selfless guardians of the ecosystem. To sum it all up, each charter member of the BMW SS coughed up $1 million initiation fee, plus an annual payment of $10,000 to the government and annual dues of $10,000 to the BMW SS, all funds tax deductible. It sounded like a win-win situation. Besides, the governors and their money-minded cohorts didn't object to spending a nickel on insurance if they could save $1 down the road. 30 years later, climate change became a serious issue. The BMW SS kicked the plan up a notch. They divided the country into 10 geographic regions and selected a discrete real estate broker to handle each region. The real estate boys took the list of qualified benefactors for their region who weren't yet dues-paying BMW SS members. Their mission was to bring the rest of the wealthy on board to the program. In exchange for a handsome commission, of course, the new member rich guys were expected to pony up $2 million each to sponsor a quarter-acre plot of land inside the bob. Same deal as before, except the price had doubled due to inflation. And since they weren't charter members of the BMW SS, the newbies had to go to the back of the line. There wasn't any rush. Worst case situation, climate might cause sea levels to rise 3 feet by the end of the 21st century. Although that was arguably a serious issue, they had plenty of time to fund the project, build the underground towns, invent the technological niceties, deal with sociological problems, and initiate a gradual population migration from the two coasts into the erstwhile Badlands of Montana. Once they had the first underground sanctuary ready for occupation, say 20 years hence, they could begin the gradual process of relocating families. Figure 50 families a month. Over a 50-year period, they figured they could relocate 30,000 families without raising undue suspicion or animosity from the press or the outside world. It would be the longest running rich guy's road trip in history. That's how it was supposed to work. Here's how it actually worked. Back in the 60s, there was a story about the IBM computer salesman and his SE, systems engineer. The salesman was responsible for placing the orders, and the SE was responsible for configuring the system once the customer received the equipment. One weekend, the two went out bear hunting. They set up a campsite, big main tent, fire pit, and a gasoline-powered generator outside, two cots inside near the rear tent flap, and a commercial chest freezer, a sturdy camp table, a full set of butcher knives, and a circular bandsaw up by the front tent flap. The salesman, exhausted from all that manual labor, went directly to bed. The SE stayed up late reading Stranger in a Strange Land, a science fiction classic by Robert A. Heinlein, by the flickering light of the campfire. "We make a good team," said the salesman the next morning over breakfast. "Why don't we do the same thing out here in the wild that we do back in the city? I'll go out, hunt the bears down, and bring them back to camp. You dress them out and freeze the bear meat. When we get home, we split the meat 50-50, and you get to keep all the bear hides. Make your wife a nice coat. Deal?" "Deal," agreed the SE. He wasn't quite awake yet, having read his Heinlein paperback until way past midnight. The SE cleaned up after breakfast, washed the dishes, and was about to get back into his Heinlein book when he heard a furious uproar outside. Suddenly, the salesman burst through the front tent flap, followed in hot pursuit by a 600-pound grizzly bear. "Here's your first bear," hollered the salesman as he dashed out the back. "I'll go get us another one." Anyhow, you get the idea. Meanwhile, work on Sanctuary was proceeding apace. Train tracks in the original tunnel reached all the way back to Whitefish. A second tunnel had been drilled from the underground cave to the farm in Kalispell. Overhead power lines stretched across the tops of both tunnels. An electric locomotive and 4 antique Pullman coaches stood ready on the Kalispell tracks. Another electric locomotive, 2 Pullman coaches, and 3 boxcars stood ready on the Whitefish tracks. All necessary parts for an advanced breeder nuclear reactor had been freighted in from the train depot in Whitefish and assembled in one corner of the underground cave. It was online and generating power by the gazilliwatt. The arc welders from New York had their fornies sparking away. The electricians were hard at work wiring up the residential dwelling. The tape and texture boys were putting the finishing touches on the model apartments. The plumbers were busy laying miles of PVC pipe. And then a bulletin came in. Miami Beach was underwater.